Yes. This talk is for Shannon because I don't even remember now, but like 6 months ago, you were like, I would like to know more about like cameras and specifically like when you move from like your phone to a big boy camera. So that's kind of what this is. This is not like photography 101. This is cameras 101. And I kind of did the same thing as you. I wrote it a long time ago, but unlike you, I didn't check it yesterday. It's like 70 slides, so it's going to be really fast, really lightning. It'll be fine, it'll be fine. So yeah, cameras 101, and mostly I want to talk about, oh god, not that.
No.
Shenanigans. Shenanigans, yep.
Don't breathe on it, I guess.
Next time will be TVs 101. Okay, yeah, like different modes on cameras, why different modes exist and what they do and why you would need to care about them if you were doing anything other than taking pictures on your phone. So effectively, a camera is a dark box and it measures light. That's what a camera is, not very tricky. So you have this dark box and to take a photograph, you open the aperture, which is just a hole. Photons come through that hole and you detect them somehow, and then you close that hole and you've captured your photo. Super simple, right? Super simple. So the area of your sensor, that can be like film in a film camera or like this electrical sensor in a modern DSLR. The areas that get hit by more photons will be brighter, and the areas that get hit by fewer photons will be darker, lightly dark. So for example, in this picture, like the area that's receiving direct sunlight, that's getting a lot more photons on the corresponding part of the sensor. And the area that's not like in darkness and shadow is receiving many fewer photons on the sensor, and that's how the camera distinguishes between light and dark areas. When we look at like the overall brightness of a photo, we call that like exposure. So for example, this would be considered underexposed. Good, it actually shows up like it should. Kind of murky and dark, right? Yes? Yes, good. Kind of murky and dark, not enough light was allowed in. This is overexposed, like way too bright. Like we've let way too much light in for the duration of this photograph. You're typically aiming for like a correct exposure where this is reasonably representative of what it looked like on the day with your eye. That's kind of what you're trying to capture for the most part. So there are 3 parameters in determining what the overall exposure of a picture is going to be. First one is that aperture, and specifically how big you allow it to be. So this is someone like manually actuating the size of the aperture, so you can see kind of like the smallest size it can be up to the largest size it can be. So when you take a photograph, the aperture will be set to a specific size, and that will determine like essentially the volume of light that can be let in per second. So a bigger hole means the overall image will be brighter, and this is a bigger hole is what we would call a smaller f-stop. So if you ever see like f numbers on things, what they're indicating is the capacity of the lens to like change the size of that hole. And so like it's typically represented in this way, like f1, f1.4. The jump between each of these steps is halving the amount of light that gets in, so halving the area of the hole. The second parameter is shutter speed. Is this playing? Good, yeah. So there's actually like 2 motions happening here. There's a mirror which is like moving out of the way, and then that like fast flick is the shutter opening and closing. So like the mirror flips up, shutter opens and closes, and the mirror flips back down again. Ignore the mirror. It's like an old piece of technology that is dying a slow death. But that whole, like the shutter opens briefly and then closes, that dictates like how long we're letting light into the box for. So if the shutter moves more slowly, it's open for longer, and that means the image is going to be brighter. Again, more light inside. This one we measure as a duration. So we might say that the shutter speed is like 2 seconds. That means I'm going to hold it open for 2 seconds before closing it. And again, we work on this factor of like halving. It will become clear in a minute why. The third parameter is ISO, and this is a little bit more difficult to understand. It doesn't correspond quite so directly to something physical we can sort of look at and play with. All you need to know is that a higher ISO number means a brighter image. It doesn't really have meaningful units. We measure it on the scale of hundreds, and again, we use a scale where you double the values, and that corresponds to a doubling in the brightness. So with film, for example, this could be like how photosensitive the chemicals on the film are. With a digital camera, it's typically like about sensitivity of the individual pixels. So one thing should be clear, we've got these three levers we can pull to change the overall brightness of the photo. So if I give you one overall brightness, you can pull some of those levers in combination, keeping the overall brightness the same, but changing the individual values. That's why we use a scale of halving and doubling everywhere, so that it's very easy to figure out how to swap. So if I want to keep the same exposure and double the shutter speed, I'll have to double the size of the aperture to make sure the overall exposure stays the same. So what that means in particular is that this is there is no unique set of those three parameters that gives you the correct photograph. There's an infinite number of combinations effectively that will give you correct exposure. So that's where the art starts to happen, where you have to start making decisions about how to combine those three. So these are the artistic effects of each of those three parameters. So aperture is what controls, roughly speaking, what controls the depth of field of an image. So for example, on the left, this is taken with a bigger aperture. You can see that the depth of field, the amount of the image which is in focus is much smaller, kind of only the top edge of the flower here, and anything further back is out of focus. Image on the right is of the same flower, but it's taken with a smaller hole, and the depth of field, the amount of the image which is in focus is much larger. The shutter speed, this one's probably the easiest to understand the artistic effect. This is used if you want to freeze or blur motion. So on the left, for example, half a second is a relatively long amount of time for someone who's moving in an image, so you can see there's blurring effects around the hair and that kind of thing. Versus on the right, that's a plane flying, carrying a shuttle, moving quite fast, looks stationary in the photograph because the shutter speed is really, really fast. So you sort of froze the motion. ISO is not very exciting. It typically is used to compensate when you are forced to make particular choices about the other two parameters. So for example, this picture was taken with a really big aperture, and it was taken with kind of the longest shutter speed you can have before your hands start to blur the image. But it was also taken somewhere really dark, so in order to achieve the correct exposure, the ISO had to be relatively high. So it's typically compensating for dark, very dark areas, things like that. So let's relate these back to camera modes. So the automatic mode is kind of this. This is what your phone is doing most of the time. The camera is going to guess the exposure. It's going to look at the scene and say, how bright should this be? And it's going to set all three parameters on your behalf. And you're going to have no control. Does everything for you, which is generally pretty good. Generally works fairly well, right? Phones make good pictures. Sometimes the camera's going to guess wrong. So this was a classic example where, because the scene on the right was quite dark, the camera was like, oh, I need to make everything much brighter. I really need to brighten up this image. And in doing so, it kind of futzed with what the actual representation of the color was. So this was a fail of the automatic mode of a camera. So kind of the next level of control that you have is what's called program mode. So in this mode, the camera will still guess the exposure, but then you're allowed to make an adjustment. So you can say, I know, based on what I can see in front of me, you're going to call this too dark, and so I can tell you to make it less dark. And then once you've made this adjustment just to the overall exposure, the camera will still pick all the parameters for you. So again, these are examples where the camera might guess wrong. There's a lot of darkness on the left-hand photo, and then there's a deliberate desire to have a very bright right-hand photo. And the user can come in and basically say, I want this to be explicitly darker than you're going to guess, or I want it to be explicitly brighter than you're going to guess. The next mode is shutter priority. Very straightforward. The camera is going to guess the exposure. Instead of this time, the user can adjust the exposure again, and the user can also say, okay, I'm going to specify this one of the three parameters. And then the camera will set the remaining two. So it's kind of one level more of specification from the user and one level less from the camera. So you use this for something where, this for example, rodeo action, you're probably going to want, the most important thing for you is that the shutter speed is very high to freeze the motion. So this would be an example case where you'd want to use shutter priority to say, definitely make sure you have a high shutter speed and then you pick the rest. Don't really care. Aperture priority is the equivalent, but for aperture. So the camera guesses the exposure, you can adjust the overall exposure, and then you can also say, this is the aperture I would like you to use, and then the remaining two parameters will be picked on your behalf. So again, another example. Here, the desired effect was very shallow depth of field, all that stuff in the background nice and blurry, and all the stuff that's in detail at the front very clear. So the priority was to have a wide aperture, and then the camera can pick whatever else it wants. Don't really care about the ISO or the shutter speed here. It's taken on a tripod, so shutter speed is effectively irrelevant. And then manual mode, super obvious. You specify all three of those parameters. Really, like fairly specialized cases need this. One example is lightning photography. Did some of this in Tucson. Really fun, but you effectively have two competing light sources here. You have like the background light and also like that flash of lightning. And that's a case where it's really valuable to be able to specify all three of those levers independently. The camera is never going to take this picture by itself. So what should you do as a user who has just acquired a new SLR, let's say? You just start on P mode because it's basically automatic that you'll start to think about how you might want to compensate for the camera's view of the overall darkness of the picture. And then pretty much after that, you might want to move on to using A or S modes for situations where you particularly want to prioritize one or the other. It's rare that you will ever want to use a full manual mode. And then there's a lot of stuff that I haven't talked about here, which is super fun. I'm going to list like 7 things, but those 7 things are like 7 of the most important, and there's like 20 more. Other things to think about are framing choices. So you can take 2 images of the same scene and frame them differently as part of your photography. We haven't talked about flash at all. That's, again, introducing a new light source into the scene. Processing, which is taking an image straight out of camera and turning it into something that is more representative of perhaps what you saw or experienced on the day. Haven't said anything about lenses or focal length. Haven't said anything about sensor size, which is a huge thing for smartphones, and it's why a lot of this depth of field stuff is not available to us on smartphones. And I haven't said anything about white balance either. Again, so much more to discuss. Very interesting. No idea how long this has been, probably longer than 7 minutes. One thing I will say, one of the things that I was bad at when I got into photography more was like I stopped taking like snapshot pictures. Don't do that. Keep taking snapshot pictures. It's super important. You'll want to look back at them, even if they're like technically really crappy photographs later on. And that's pretty much the end of it. But this is an awesome website for all things understanding how a camera works related. It's obviously British, but it's super awesome. Recommended.